Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Sabah al khair. Buenas noches, buenos días. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Good evening. Masa al khair for the people who are joining us from other parts of the world. We are so honored to be organizing and presenting this Ahmed Studies, Arab, Muslim and Ethnicities and Diasporas Open Classroom webinar on the question of who owns Jewishness. We are very honored to have esteemed guests, but before I start doing anything else, I want to acknowledge that we gather on the traditional lands of the indigenous people, past and present, and honor and with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded this throughout generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. San Francisco State University sits the unceded indigenous land of the Ohlone and the Wammash people, and I am now on the East Coast on the land of the Lenape people who have been displaced. Also, as a Palestinian, indigenous Palestinian, I'll also acknowledge that this is where we're coming from, and this is what we are doing, and where we are here today. Secondly, I would like to welcome everybody here that is joining us. I would like to elaborate a little bit on this, just for people who are joining. This is the Ahmed Studies, Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies, Open Classroom. This is part of the Teaching Palestine Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice series. And this is a beginning conversation that we will be continuing throughout the year, and of course, just not only throughout the year, but this is for this year. That is for 3 different classes of Ahmed: Introduction to Arab American Feminisms, Palestine Ethnic Studies Perspective, and Colonialism, Imperialism and Resistance, Third World Movements Then and Now. Some of the titles are a bit long. As you understand, sometimes it's very hard to catch everything in a soundbite. This inaugural roundtable will kick off a living archives conversation. We can talk about each topic comes from a different place, and we would situate it. Many of them come as a result of collaborative work and collective. For example, the name itself, Living Archives, conversation series, bringing together different generations from and outside and within the former classrooms in the US and internationally. We go by the notion that has been popularized by Palestinian prisoners who say that the prison is a university. And this also is enacted in many other places, specifically also in the US, where we are now by freedom prisoners from the indigenous, Black struggle, Latinx, Asian, and all the struggles who have been marginalized, whether on the basis of labor, ideology, politics, gender, sexuality, language, migration status, all of the aspects that I am mentioning and that I may be forgetting. It's really, really important for us to be able to mention that. This webinar series also comes as a result of our collaboration that builds upon what we have done last year with, for example, Al-Adab Journal, and we remember our comrade, the late Dr. Samah Idris, that we've done several webinars on Black lives, Black liberation, and the indivisibility of justice. Another one on indigenous Black and Brown liberation, abolition, reparation, and resistance. We commemorated the Sabra and Shatila massacre last year in collaboration with actually 2 years ago, with the General Union of Palestine students. We did a webinar with Eyewitness Palestine titled From Colonization to Solidarity, Narratives of Defeat and Sumud. We worked jointly with our colleagues in the Black movement, intellectuals led by the National Black Education Agenda and others, entitled From Vietnam to Palestine, the New York Times Black Statement, which spoke about the New York Times statement in 1970 that was published in solidarity with Palestinians, and which many Black intellectuals and leading radicals have signed, and we had multiple panels throughout 2019 and actually 2020, which was the 50th anniversary. We collaborate with the Asian American Studies and communities in Asian Americans, Japanese, Zaniachi, and other Asian communities around the Japanese Day of Remembrance, which we have just held 3 events this past 2 weeks alone, and we will be doing more. And we have collaborated with the events with the strikers of the 1968 at San Francisco State University. In fact, we are inspired by what we call the spirit of 68, and we have several webinars. One of them is called the Spirit of 68: Third World Studies, from Third World Studies to Palestine, a conversation with Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front. We organized several webinars on feminist and queer liberation. Specifically, I'm proud to say, with my colleague, Professor Tomomi Kinakawa of Women and Gender Studies, through which our webinar in 2020, September 23rd, that was called Whose Narratives, Gender, Justice and Resistance, a conversation with Layla Khalid, was shut down, censored by Zoom and other big tech social media groups. And we've tried to do it again in April 2021, along with our colleague Sean Malloy from University of California, Merced, and it was shut down as well. Several people here have actually participated. We're supposed to be participating on the panel itself. We did have the panel, but we could not broadcast it live, such as our comrade Ronika Sreels from South Africa, as well as our comrade and colleague Sandy Franklin from University of Hawaii, who was one of the groups that are under the umbrella of the USAC, the United States Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, that organized a series of events a month later on October 23rd, 2020, in solidarity. And I'm very happy to say that we actually have won our grievance when the faculty hearing panel has unanimously ruled in our favor, said that San Francisco State was complicit in shutting us down and censoring and violating our academic freedom, that they harmed me and my colleague Tomomi Kinakawa, and that they should apologize to us, and that they should facilitate the having of the webinar without any problems or intervention by big tech companies that are trying to intervene in the content of our classrooms and what we are doing. And of course, this is very much connected to critical race theory, to attacks on ethnic studies, and especially critical ethnic studies that speaks about the liberation of people, including the liberation of Palestine, as well as communities of color, the question of Black lives and indigeneity, and so on and so forth. We also did, after April 2021, webinar was shut down. Facebook not only shut down our webinar, our event itself, but actually shut down the whole Ahmed Facebook page. And so we had to be hosted as a temporary refuge for our events with the People's Forum, with whom we are so thankful. And we were able to at least do several events, including virtual 10-year reunion of the Indigenous and Women of Color Feminist Delegation to Palestine when we went in 2011, and we were able to host the 10th anniversary on June 23rd, and also we published an article on the date of in July, on which we published our statement, which has been shared by many people, and we can discuss it. We've discussed it in multiple other locations and webinars. We had a panel not long ago called Resisting French Imperialism, 60 years since the 1961 massacre of Algerians in Paris. We had a big webinar on the 20th anniversary of September 11th, 2001, also called Whose Narratives, in order for us to be able to define and discuss what did 9/11/2001 mean to the US, what did it mean to the world, and how other 9/11s, such as 1973, the coup d'etat against the Chilean democratically elected President Salvador Allende took place. But within the US, it's very US-centric and does not actually pay attention. So we thought this would be really important for us as educators, as scholars, as advocates for justice-centered knowledge production to do that. We also had a couple of other webinars, also in conjunction with our colleague Tomomi Kinakawa. One was called Situated Knowledge and Critical Inquiry, Can the Subaltern Speak, with 3 amazing Palestinian feminists. Manal Hamza, Mahasen Nasruddin, and Dareen Tatur, who was also covered by one of our guests, Yoav Haifawi. We had another one called Gender and Sexual Justice from Kashmir to Mexico, Haiti and Palestine to Zaniechi, Korean communities, and that was part of the class Comparative Border Studies, Palestine and Mexico. The other one was a part of the class Gender and Modernity in Arab and Muslim Communities. And we had an event called Comparative Criminalizations, Repression and Resistance Across Borders, to name a few. These are all available in multiple places, and maybe we can, if possible, we can just post it on the live chat now for people to know. We are the second thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to thank first the people who made this happen. One is all of you, our esteemed panelists, comrades, siblings, friends, colleagues, with whom we have been organizing and struggling day in and day out, and I'm sure I'm not going to be able to cover everything. Secondly, I want to thank specifically Laith Ghulum, who is a graduate student in ethnic studies and in Ahmed studies at the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, whose work is on queer Tehrangeles and who has been extremely amazing as both as a teaching assistant and disabilities assistant, working with me for the classes and making this possible and also helping up with the graphics. We also want to thank one of our students, my students, Troy, who designed the flyer. And also we want to thank Carlos Latouf, the amazing cartoonist and artist, Lebanese Brazilian. He says, "My heart is Palestine," who has allowed us to use the graphic that is going on today. So what we are going to do today, just to be able to mention how we're running this, we are going to have 3 rounds of discussions. The first round is going to be to ask our esteemed panelists who you are, just define who you are, what's happening with you, and sort of really just a firm situated knowledge. The second round will be on who owns Jewishness, diversity, richness, and the long and complicated history. And the third one is going to be on where do we go from here? And then we will end up with questions and answers from the audience and students. I should just say that end my comments, introductory comments, by saying that we are going to be doing now is we will be hearing from our panelists. We promised you that this is the order, but as you know, we run these open classrooms in organic manner, in spontaneous manner. We are an ongoing conversation. I want to emphasize again that this is the beginning conversation. We can have we can have up to 10 panelists, but we thought that we will not be able to even today, full conversation with all the rich lives of all of you here today with us. So for the people who are watching and for the students, bear with us. Our students are also supposed to be reaching out to you. They may want to interview you. We are definitely serious about the Teaching Palestine Pedagogical Process and the Indivisibility of Justice project to do oral history and archival, compile interviews with all of you. Some of the people who we really would like to continue involving are, for example, members of the Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon, Jamil, who were very active in 1982. We would like to involve groups who have been organizing historically, for example, in Israel, members of the Matzpin Party, of the Israeli Communist Party. And so we would like to be able to involve who Boycott from Within, who Prophets. There are so many organizations that have been involved, so many individuals in and out. There are a list of intellectuals, Jewish scholars and intellectuals that we would like them to be involved. There are many people who are doing social media, such as Mundowise, Jewish Currents. There are groups, including Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's really, really important to emphasize that this is a beginning conversation and going. So we will be asking you again. And we hope that it's okay for us to impose on your time and ask you again to come and join with us. And two, that we were not going to be able to cover everything. And three, for our students who are going to be covering this, they are reading. A lot of you reading. So if you have more, we shared tons with all the classes. Please share more with us. And so they may have questions now, but they are going to also be writing journals and these journal assignments about that, and may actually reach out and want to be involved more and more. And our students are a very, very diverse group, wonderful, amazing, and engaging. And with that, I am going to stop the introduction and get onto the first round and ask if anybody would like to jump in, or should I actually just call on somebody and go on the first face on the screen and maybe call on Cindy to open up, if that's okay. And Cindy is at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Please, if you don't mind, we're just going to do brief introductions at the beginning and then move on. Is that okay? Please, Cindy, I'm going to go on mute. Unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody, and greetings from occupied Hawaii, where I teach at the University of Hawaii in the English department. And I am a member of the US ACB Organizing Collective since 2014, and also a founding member of Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine at the University of Hawaii. I've also been active in Sabeel, Hawaii, which works very closely with our SFJP. And I co-edit the journal Biography, where we actually have, with the support of the staff there, made that, I think, a welcome space for Palestinian scholars and activists.
Okay. I should also add that Cindy has been also very much involved in the US ACB, United States Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel Organizing Committee, and also has been one of the people who organized the October 23rd solidarity events with after our open classroom was shut down. Cindy also was one of the leaders, if not the leading persons. I know we want to emphasize collectivity, of organizing the Stop Canary Mission list for the Academic Advisory Council of Jewish Voice for Peace and more. So we will come to that more and more. And I was wondering if we could go to Kate next.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for being here. My name is Kate Raphael. I'm a long-distance member of Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism, which is a Bay Area group that started in early 2001 in response to the Second Intifada and the brutality of the Israeli military in repressing it. But we actually came out of a earlier group that was called Dykes and Gay Guys Emergency Response that formed in the lead up to the first U.S. war against Iraq in 1990 and 91. And so we've been active. We're definitely the longest existing queer Palestine solidarity group in the world, and we're one of the first groups in the country to come together around a BDS agenda, a boycott, sanctions, divestment sanctions agenda, even before 2005. I'll just say personally, I grew up in a fairly religious Jewish family and a very Zionist family. One side of my family, one set of grandparents was from Ukraine, from near Kiev, but they were Russians, spoke Russian, and they were socialists and supporters of the 1905 Russian Revolution. And my grandfather emigrated after participating in that failed revolution in Russia. The other side of my family came from Romania, and much of their family was wiped out. The people who stayed behind were wiped out by the Nazis. And I'll also just say I spent a couple of years in Palestine working with the International Women's Peace Service and the International Solidarity Movement. And out of that experience, I wrote 2 mysteries that are set in Palestine. I think the first mysteries written in English with a Palestinian policewoman as a protagonist. And my newest novel is The Midwives in Town, is actually about underground abortion, but has an underground Jew as a protagonist. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Kate. I also should add that Kate was selected to be the Grand Marshal of the Gay Pride Parade in San Francisco and wrote a very strong statement that I assign in my classes, so my students will be reading it, in which you said that I appreciate this honor, but I must decline because I'm here in Palestine. And you were with the ISM, the International Solidarity Movement at the time, fighting against the apartheid wall in Palestine. Very, very strong statement. And we were very actually lucky to have you many times in many of our classes. We've been doing them since 2007 during Pride Month in October in San Francisco. But even after San Francisco State University cut off the funds for Pride Month, we continued organizing and doing it. And you've been very much involved. And maybe we'll come back and speak about the frame lines and the whole question of the films, if possible, when we get back to that. Thank you so much. Maybe Rani, you can go next.
Hi, good evening from South Africa, Johannesburg. I'm Ronnie Casseroles. I was born in 1938 in Johannesburg. I mention the date because it means I grew up during the Second World War. My grandparents were immigrants from Lithuania and Latvia. My father was actually born there, grew up in South Africa as a young man. So I got that background. They were not a Zionist family. They were not political. They were workers. And they were pretty secular. But I went through Hebrew school and did the bar mitzvah and basically focused on my Jewish community and the Jewishness. South Africa changed me entirely. The Sharpeville massacre, which took place just after I was 20, changed my life. I became totally involved with the African people's struggle and gradually was weaned off the Jewish background and origins, and certainly the belief system and anything relating to Zionism, through a lifetime of experience of sharing my life and my commitment with the wider community of South Africa and internationally. I served in the liberation movement my whole adult life until we found freedom in South Africa and became a minister under Nelson Mandela right through 14 years to 2008. I became very active in the Palestine struggle, the solidarity aspects, which we can come to later, and have led a number of movements in the country, not in my name, using my Jewish background to state that all Jews do not support Israel or Zionism, and helped to found the South African Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. I'm very active in that and continue to be so right through to my 84th year on Mother Earth. So that's a bit of the background and who I am.
Thank you, Rani. And I'm kind of, I see behind you the sign for the PSC, which was also hosting us when we came to South Africa, and we co-organized the Conference on Teaching Palestine with AMEC, the Afro-Middle East Center, run by Naim Jina. But I also, and you came and you spoke to us and you spoke about the liberation struggle, and we had a lot of discussion. We discussed Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and what does liberation mean, and the whole collection of the liberation movements in Algeria. I also remember how you were telling us about what was happening with your own experience. I also recall that your participation in our tirelessly in our webinar that was shut down, and we just kept running from one place to the other on September 23rd, 2020, actually trying to escape one checkpoint after another, until we were finally shut down by YouTube. And you still stayed, and you still bestowed your wisdom, and you spoke to us. And I also want to say, mention maybe when we come back, actually the letter that you wrote to your peers who were with you to school before our webinar was shut down, in which they actually kind of used language and so on. So maybe we can be able to talk about that next. And I was wondering if we could move next to Sarah Hamid. And if you people are noticing, I'm just actually like trying to defy sort of like the whole geography business. So we start in Hawaii, we went to the Northwest, now we went to South Africa, now we go back to University of Hawaii, and Sarah, who will also share with us your experience and where you're from, that covers different parts of the world. So please, Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Michal Hamid, and I am a student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I will hopefully, knock on wood, be graduating this year with my bachelor's in women, gender, sexuality studies and sustainability studies. And I am a second generation Ashkenazi Jew. I am also Kashmiri and Punjabi and Muslim. And so that makes for a very unique experience as a Jewish person. And I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. And we really would like also to speak about the question of race and ethnicity and the whole thing that, because one of the objectives is to kind of like address the whole question of, is there one particular Jewish experience singular? And what does this mean? And even when we think about all ethnicities, so we will come back to you. And very nice to meet you. This is the first time we meet online, so it's really wonderful. And welcome. And we will go next to Emaya Gilman, who is in New York. So we're moving, I don't know, east, west, depending on which part of the world you're in. Go ahead, Emaya, please.
Hey, everybody. I'm Maya. I'm in New York. I teach at NYU and in American Studies. I'll actually start with my background, and then I'll go to the work that I do. I am a pretty typical, in many ways, New York Jew. I have one parent who is Jewish and one parent who isn't. My Jewish parent was born in Palestine in 1940, so before it was Israel. And that was my father, and his family, his mother got there. She was a European Jew who had come to the United States, fleeing pogroms in whatever country it was at the time, Ukraine or Poland, whatever. It moved around, and then was recruited to make Aliyah by the labor movement, by the Jewish labor movement, and so she arrived as a sort of idealist in Palestine, and then was repatriated to the U.S. during World War II. So that's actually a pretty American Jewish path to have family ties to Israel, family ties to Europe, and also to have to have a family with one Jewish parent and one not. And it leaves, because of the way that Jewish identity is managed, it leaves the kids like me with lots of questions about authenticity and what do we speak the right language, and do we have the right Jewish parentage, and are we connected enough to Israel? And it took me a long time to realize that is actually the Jewish experience. That is an American Jewish experience. So when I was raised as an anti-racist, not necessarily in a Jewish sense, but as an anti-racist. But it turns out that that Jewish identity, that Israel and Zionism and American identity, like U.S. identity and U.S. colonialism, are at the heart of racism right now. So it turns out that those are, for someone who's raised anti-racist, to hold white and Jewish identities is actually pretty intense. So my work I came up through anti-racist organizations, but then I turned to anti-Zionist organizing. I started out in Jews Against the Occupation, which formed at the start of the Second Intifada around 2000. And then that sort of led into Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, which followed in the steps of QUIT, which is the organization that Kate helped found. And now my work is with Drop the ADL, which works to challenge the Anti-Defamation League, which is sort of supposedly a civil rights organization, but actually attacks progressive and anti-racist movements using the sort of umbrella of anti-Semitism work. So that's the work that I do.
Thank you, Imaya. And I will just add that I was also very privileged to get to know you and work with you in the queer liberation marches. And for the 50th anniversary of the uprising at the Stonewall. And then we also did it last year, this past summer. And of course, it earned me a few nasty comments from the Zionists who claimed that this was anti-Semitic for me to post the banner from queer. Yeah, I mean, whatever. That's the problem. But I also want to also say that Imaya is also just finished an amazing dissertation, doctoral dissertation at New York University, and you are now a faculty fellow at NYU. So I would like really for us to come back and speak about that, as well as the whole question of the Anti-Defamation League and the deadly exchange, and what does this mean, and what does the whole question of authenticity and representation, and how can we really speak about being anti-racist while actually encouraging a racist state? What does this mean? So before I'm not going to continue, I'm going to call on our remaining colleagues. First, Alexi in San Francisco, and then we will end this round with Yoav Haifawi from Haifa. So Alexi, please go ahead.
Good morning, or at least it is good morning here in the unceded territory of the Ohlone Ramaytush people in what is present-day San Francisco, California. My name is Alexi Folger. My day job is as a high-tech worker, and I hope to talk more about that later in terms of the role of tech in social justice more broadly. I am a longtime member of Jewish Voice for Peace, which I joined in 2004. I'm also an alum of San Francisco State and proud of that. I landed there literally the month of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which was pretty fateful for me. Maybe I'll get into this more later, but it's when I quickly abandoned my short-lived attempt to be Jewish by thinking I should support Israel. But I've been a social justice activist my whole life, and so that clearly couldn't fly. Interestingly, I am also, I moved out of New York as 12, but in my heart, I am still a New York Jew till the very end, I think. I also have one Jewish and one non-Jewish parent, or had, they're deceased now, but my mother was Jewish, so it was the right parent in terms of lineage, but definitely complicated my story. And I hope to talk more later about Jewish Voice for Peace, because ironically, that was really where I found my Jewish identity, which, like the Zionist world, we just hate that so much. And I love how subversive that is. And that really sustains my work as now a Jewish activist who spends most of my time in this area of struggle. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Alexia. And I should say that I think we got to know each other well when you came and spoke as an SFSU alumni to the University Senate after the provost, our university provost, put out a list of religious holidays, memo for faculty to respect religious holidays. And she put in Israel Independence Day as a religious day for Jews. And she's a scholar of medieval studies, but she still forgot Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr. And I will say forgot, put it maybe in parentheses. And so I contacted JVP in the Bay Area, of which Alexei is a member. And I asked, it's just, can you check this list? I mean, is this something about these holidays and so on? And I was told by our comrades in JVP that this is a problem. So I wrote a dear colleague letter to the provost, and then she did not. She wouldn't. She put the responsibility on her assistant. Very interesting for administrators to pass the buck and just have like people who are working for them actually take the blame for it. And she's like, "Oh, I didn't really check it." I'm kind of like, you would have checked it if it were not about this normalized presence of Israel. So we went to the Senate, and Alexei was one of the people who actually spoke about this. And as a result, the Senate ended up doing the revised policy about religious holidays. Unfortunately, they put the onus on the students instead of making the faculty being responsible and so on. Because now we're not going to put any religious holidays. You, the student, have to tell the faculty member when it is. So the students have to be like apprehensive about going this whole power relationship. But Alexei was one of the people who have been very organized. Alexei also spoke not long ago, at the Senate about the grievance that we've just won around the Ahmed studies as an SFSU alum. And we will come back to also maybe talking about these two, as well as the whole question of JVP and the no tech for apartheid and what's going on in the Silicon Valley and in high tech. And so last but not least, I'm really very happy to also bring about my comrade Yoav Haifawi, who is joining us from Haifa, who has been very much involved in Hirak Haifa and is in many other struggles. But I will let you introduce yourself, Yoav. And then if you don't introduce enough, maybe I will add a few points. So go ahead, please.
Okay. I was born in a small Zionist settlement in the north of Palestine. And my family was not religious at all, but were very Zionist. And I was lucky enough to become aware to what is Zionism before I had to go to the army. So actually from the age of 15, I was telling everybody that I'm not going to serve in the army because it is an army of occupation that is waging unjust wars. And I thought that I will leave Palestine as soon as I can. But actually when I was 17, I get involved in the struggle for liberation. Basically as a socialist activist and first in a leftist Jewish organization. And then from the 80s, from the beginning of the 80s, in Palestinian National Liberation Movement, also leftist Palestinian movement. And till this day, most of my time I dedicate to this struggle. And the way I see it, I see that many people here get a lot of importance for the Jewish identity. I never felt special linkage to Jewish identity. For me, the way I see it, I saw Jewishness as a religion, and as a person that is not religious in any way, I didn't feel that I have any connection to it, and I thought that like people, other people, my family is from East Europe, some of them Ukrainians and other are Russians. And I thought that as other members of the family emigrated to other countries and became American or French or Argentinian, so if I or my parents emigrated to Palestine, then I have to be a good Palestinian citizen. And because Palestine is under occupation, my duty as a good Palestinian is to liberate Palestine. The irony of the matter is that just because of this, most of my involvement is in the Palestinian struggle. So many times what happens actually is that for the people around me, I am simply the Jew. So there is a group of people, and what distinguish me for them is that I am the Jew that is with them. So from being a non-Jew in my eyes, it converts to being the Jew for many people around me. But this doesn't stop me from seeing things the way I see it. Thank you.
Unmuted. Thank you so much, Yoav. I also remember that you're also being overly modest. You were reporting a lot in May during the attacks on Gaza, during the attacks in Sheikh Jarrah. They're continuing. Silwan, you also reported about the racial violence that was conducted in Lid, in Akka, in Haifa. And also one of the things that I thought was important that you didn't mention, and the U.S. mainstream press does not mention, is that when Palestinians were arrested, there were also Israeli Jews who were arrested along and beaten up and attacked because of your opposition to what Israel is doing, and to your basically state not in my name, that this is not part of it. So I think this is something that we would also really want to come back to. But we're going to next go to maybe the next, move to the next question. Thank you all for this very brief but incredible, rich introduction. And I'm hoping our students will go dig deeper and deeper and deeper and find out more about these amazing people that are joining us today and giving us time. So we will go next to our next question: who owns Jewishness? So we would want to talk about the whole question of Jewishness. Is there one singular or multiple Jewish experiences? What do they mean? How do we understand them, whether you're in your own experiences or whether you're in your own understanding? What's the relationship between that and Zionism and anti-Semitism? There are a lot of people now who criticize Israel who are called anti-Semitic, including, I guess, all of us here, okay, or anti-Semitic or self-hating Jews. And then there is the whole question about how do we think about the diversity, and how do we uphold people's identities and life experiences and so on, and also struggle jointly for justice. It's a very big question, but I'm really hoping that we can all speak to it. So we will start with Sarah. I think we're going to go after. I just wanted to. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, Sarah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I actually proudly accept the title of being a self-hating Jew because I cannot eat gefilte fish, and I refuse to. I refuse to put gefilte fish in my body. It's something that I think we need to culturally rid ourselves of. But I was raised in a bit of a unique context because I am a matrilineal descendant Jew from my mother's side, a very, very traditional American Ashkenazi family, from New York, moved somewhere in the Midwest. My mother was a camp counselor at like all the camps. So she was very integrated in the American cultural Jewish identity formation that was happening, specifically in the post-World War II kind of generation of Ashkenazi Jews. And then my father is Muslim. He's Punjabi and Kashmiri. And I spent a lot of time in Palestine in Akka, and kind of spent the majority of my childhood summers there, and grew up around Palestinians in Akka. So it's a very kind of strange experience, I guess, in the context of most American Jews, whatever that means. And in that, I encountered like disgusting amounts of racism. I was in, Hebrew school classes and studying for my bat mitzvah, and I was often the only Jew of color in any of those spaces, the only Jewish woman of color, and realistically had much more cultural knowledge than the other students. I spent a lot of time around people that spoke Hebrew. My mother spoke Hebrew to me. I I went to ACO a lot in my upbringing, was consistently pushed towards going into Jewish camps and consistently pushed towards going into birthright and different things like that. Never did any of that because it's weird. It's very weird. The concept of all of these projects is very strange. And honestly, when I think about the links specifically within the American Jewish community and racism, I see how the programs and institutions that exist to kind of bolster up like American Jewish fervor for Israel is rooted in white supremacy. It's rooted in this very like Ashkenazi centric understanding of Jewish identity. My mom's adopted family, when she went to live on a kibbutz, is all Mizrahi. And so I also grew up around a lot of Mizrahi Iraqi Jews, and hearing their experiences and just even seeing their experiences in Israel is enough to demonstrate to me that if my own experience in American Jewish communities that are Zionist, explicitly Zionist communities, is rooted in racism, and the experiences of other Jews of color, even in, you know, the center of alleged Jewish excellence, right, Israel, why is it that our experiences are shrouded in racism? They're shrouded in comments consistently questioning our identity, questioning our place, questioning our cultural ties. I remember a student at my high school graduation, I decided to sing, you know, I was in high school, so I decided to sing Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, you know what I mean? Like, let's kumbaya it out. And I was told that they asked her to sing a song as well because I wasn't really Jewish, because I'm brown and because my dad's Muslim. And that just defies, first off, the like logic of the Jewish community, which is like matrilineal Jews are the most, you know, Jewish, which is already like a eugenicist logic. Like, it's a logic that is kind of rooted in white supremacy. But that has been my experience specifically in the American Jewish Zionist community. And I started organizing in Palestinian solidarity movements when I was like 15 or 16, and was met with a lot of resistance from people that I had known my entire life, people that, you know, have seen me and heard my experiences and listened to my experience my entire life. And I think that's indicative of the like very liberal politics that, you know, the American Zionist movement uses to kind of like push out Jews that are anti-Zionist, and Jews that love Palestine, and Jews that hate Israel. And I think that's something that needs to be unpacked, because more often than not, I see it rooted in white supremacy. More often than not, I see Jews of color being excluded. I see non-matrilineal Jews being excluded. And that is not a cultural value that we hold in Jewish community. That's a cultural value of white supremacy. So yeah, that's a little bit of it.
Thank you, Sarah. I was also thinking, I mean, a lot of the times actually, when I teach, and it's, well, I'm Palestinian, when I teach all my classes, I always put Owns Jewishness or one variation, because students don't necessarily know, they equate Jewishness with Israel and Zionism. But a lot of the times I also go back to the whole question of 1492 and the Iberian Peninsula and the ways in which Muslims and Jews were actually persecuted by the Catholic kings who basically abused what Christianity stood for. And I say abused because if you go to Palestine and you're here in Bethlehem and you think about the various clergy in Palestine and so on, including the clergy that like invites Muslims to have Eid celebrations in churches and so on, and kind of like supposed to be the Holy Land, the land of peace and so on. So I think that's also like something that it's really, really important to kind of like bring about and think about it. And this is maybe people can also speak to that, the whole question of what a Jewish experience is, because the US, the defining Jewish experience is the European, the Ashkenazi Jewish experience. But the Sephardic, the Mizrahi, The experiences are never ever mentioned, never ever mentioned. I remember one of my colleagues who spoke at one point said that he was doing all this work and he went to Brazil to look for his colleagues, and then he had a whole discussion, and then people said to him, okay, we understand all you're saying. What is Zionism? Jews, Moroccan Jews. And he was talking about like a whole books in Israel that don't talk at all about the experiences of what happened for Sephardic Arab Jews and so on. So I think this is something that we definitely is one thing that we really need to kind of like expand upon. There is a group around Jews of color. So, but without further ado, I really want to go into our next. I think it was going to be Kate, if I'm not mistaken, or was Kate, right? Was that the
No,
one?
Maya.
Oh, Amaya. I'm sorry, Amaya. Go, Amaya. I'm looking at the comments from the audience and so on. So I'm really sorry about that. Yes, Amaya.
It's okay.
And the reason we want Amaya because Amaya has to go, like Amaya is teaching and joining with us. So
Yeah,
she also
multitasking.
her students, so she's back and forth. So please go ahead, Amaya.
That's true. Okay, thank you. Sarah, it's actually really great to hear these conversations have been going on, for so long. Sometimes it feels like we say the same things over and over again, and it can get kind of draining, to hear ourselves talk. So it's actually really, really great to hear like new voices and fresh voices. I really appreciate hearing your thoughts and new face. It's just so good. And I look forward to being in more conversation. No harm to the old ones on the call. So when I saw this question, like who owns Jewishness, and like where does Zionism fit in all of this? It just makes me want to go back to the core question for me and the work that we're doing right now of like, why do we need to drop the ADL? Like we talk about drop the ADL. The Anti-Defamation League is sort of like this looming organization in American life. It's kind of everywhere. It does so many things. It's like a civil rights organization. And every time there's a white nationalist attack, like there's the Anti-Defamation League. Every time there's an anti-Semitism, there's the Anti-Defamation League. It's like they do everything. So why, how can an organization that's everywhere be wrong? Like, how could they be allowed to be everywhere? And the thing is that the thing that makes them so mobile is that anti-Semitism is such an important and powerful idea, such an important mobilizing idea in American life, because it represents everything. It's like the Holocaust, right? Like it's like the whole organizing principle of U.S. life since World War II. There have been two, right? There's like be against the Holocaust, like don't be a fascist, right? And then also be for civil rights, be against racism. And for the Anti-Defamation League does both of them, or be for democracy, like maybe that's another one. And the Anti-Defamation League kind of holds all of those things. And it holds all of those things, like being anti-racist at the same time as also not being so scary because it's a white organization. So we have like these calls to support civil rights and to like sort of make it institutional. But then when you have an organization that's run by Black people, then the people are like, oh, maybe that's a little scary. Maybe like let's turn to the people who like are a little more reasonable, right? A little less on the edge. And the Anti-Defamation League occupies that space. And so it holds it does the work of like being against anti-Black racism and also being against anti-Semitism. And it's been around for a long time, and they do great media work. And so they just have this incredibly big footprint in US life. And it's a Zionist organization. It's like completely separate from its work as a civil rights organization. I mean, not separate, but like in this sort of separate part of its brain, it's a Zionist organization. And so you have this organization that's doing all this civil rights work, whose primary goal, whose primary work is Zionism. And that's why we started looking at it. That's why I started looking at it as a researcher. But it turns out that even before it was a Zionist organization, even before, which started maybe even around, not even in 1948, but around the mid 50s, maybe, that even before Israel was before Israel existed, before Zionism was important, that the Anti-Defamation League was a settler organization. Like even before like the big wave of immigration that brought Russian immigrant Jews to the US and created like the immigrant labor movement, that's sort of like the story of Jewish identity that most American Jews think of as Ashkenazi history, right? Even before that, the Anti-Defamation League was like white German Jews who were like the elites who wanted to like who were worried that the new Russian Jewish immigrants were like a little edgy, a little dirty, like a little too radical, a little too Russian. They were settlers. And their commitment to fighting anti-Semitism was about making sure that about protecting the U.S. and protecting whiteness and the settler legacy. And so when they became Zionist, that just translated really well onto a new settler project. So, and when they became also the holders of an anti-racist legacy, suddenly they had like both an enormous amount of moral power that they operate in our name, and also they're doing this huge racist project, this huge colonial project. So for me, that's where does Zionism fit in my thought and life? It's like, yes, it's this project that arises like in my name as a Jew, right? In the name of Jewishness and in the second half of the 20th century, but it's actually operationalizing a power that goes much further back. And so, yeah, so for me, Zionism isn't a new, like this project that we're fighting isn't a new thing. It's like the extension of a much older kind of power. The one thing that I will say about the Anti-Defamation League is that I feel like it's really important for people to understand right now is that because it's civil rights, because the Anti-Defamation League does so much work in the space of civil rights, like it does legal work. The Anti-Defamation League has defined like hate crimes law and like all the ways that we talk about fairness, and its main project is Zionism. So anti-Palestinian racism is the main rationale for so much of the civil rights law and so much of the civil rights language that we use. Like we're going to have to rethink all of that. For me, that's our project right now. How do we think about Zionism and anti-Semitism together? That's the way. Sorry, I might have taken up more time than I was allowed, but
that's okay. Thank you so much, Amaya. I mean, I do remember, like for me, actually, the first time I learned about the Anti-Defamation League was through the work of the reporter Jeff Blankford, whose actually first experience was taking tons of pictures in Palestinian refugee camps and Palestinian resistance movement in the late 60s. And then he wrote this article about the Anti-Defamation League, how they were spying on people like the American AAUG, Arab American University graduates, against Japanese organizers, against indigenous people, against people who are organizing the Chicana movement. Also, they actually spied on opponents of the South African racist regime and provided the information to the South African Secret Service. They spied on Iranians who were opposing the Iranian Shah regime and provided the information to the Savak. I mean, it was just like it exploded, all of it. And they were also in one of the homes of one of the organizers with the Anti-Defamation League, or the members. They also found either a key or access to the home of Alex Ode, the West Coast Regional Director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, who was then assassinated, and his killers are still hiding in Israel by Israel. Israel refuses to extradite them. So one of the things that I think is really important here is this whole kind of like dissonance, because every time you open the paper to look about forms of racism, there's the Anti-Defamation League again and again. And then I think it was 2 weeks ago, the director called Palestinians ISIS after the Amnesty International report calling Israel apartheid. So it's kind of like, I think really the research that you're doing is so important and so kind of like central, and I think it's really important to stay within the academy so our colleagues can actually be challenged to not not be subject to the new forms of McCarthyism and be silenced, and also, which is some of the stuff that Cindy talked about, works about, and then secondly into the whole question of the movement and basically challenging that you cannot have different kinds of justice. You can't advocate justice for one thing and not advocate justice for the other. So the next person is on my list is Kate, Raphael. So we go back to you, Kate.
Yeah, but Emea wanted to add something.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, you're such a nice advocate. Thank you. I just wanted to add that that Sarah raised the effort that's been happening over the last few years to sort of make space, and Rabab raised also to make space in this sort of European Jewish centered narratives in American Jewish culture for Jews of color, like to sort of decenter the European Jewish narratives. And there's been so much organizing by Jews of color to do that. And the Anti-Defamation League has seen that and is now kind of seizing on that and using, like, it's kind of gross, like saying like, oh, we're gonna celebrate Jews of color, and now sort of coming into that space to try and use that now to do more of the same. So I just wanted to note that they're very adaptable. And to have a look out for that, and also trying to sort of reposition Jews as indigenous, because now indigeneity is kind of a powerful idea. So, they don't stand still. That's all.
Maybe when we have a chance, I'm going to call on Kate, but maybe just not to forget that one of the recent phenomena in the academy is called diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that might be also something by which institutions who are corporatized are actually using indigenous people of color, Black people, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim people to actually push the agenda in order to kind of conflate. So I think let's just maybe talk about that. Kate, go ahead.
Well, I want to say I do agree with Sarah. I cannot eat gefilte fish, and I would support the banning of it, but I do adore kugel. So let's just get that out there. I mean, I grew up with a really strong Jewish identity in a place where there were plenty of Jews. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, where there were plenty of Jews, but we were really a small minority. And so I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. And when I was in high school, the high school that I attended was about 85% Black. And so a lot of my identification increasingly was with Black culture. And I spoke Black English, more or less, at least at school. And when I wasn't at home, and sometimes slipping into it at home, I considered going to an HBCU, although I didn't end up doing that, and instead ended up at a college where about 75% of the white students were Jewish, which really changed my relationship to Judaism and to Jewishness. And suddenly, from it being an identity that was really important to me because it was a minority identity and an embattled identity, it felt like very mainstream, and I hadn't grown up with that. And as I experienced that, sort of the further away from Jewishness, from Jewish identity being core to me, I moved. And so then sort of Palestine, my involvement in the Palestine struggle, which started, like Alexi said, in 1982, really was my watershed moment with the invasion of Lebanon and the massacres in Sabra and Shatila. That was sort of the moment when questions that I had for a long time sort of came to the fore, and I had to make a decision. I had to sort of take a stand, and my stand was, okay, I'm not a Zionist. Don't talk to me about Israel. And I tried to hold that position really for a very long time, up until I would say the first Intifada, when sort of I realized that just wasn't tenable. And it was a long struggle for me to move away from Zionism, and I won't go into that, but I will say at a certain point, I realized that identifying as an anti-Zionist was something I needed to do at a certain point because it involved making a break with my former identity. But now I don't call myself an anti-Zionist. I call myself, as I always have been, an anti-imperialist, an anti-authoritarian, and anti-colonialist. And I feel like one of the things that I've learned over my years in this movement is that we need to stop exceptionalizing Jewishness and Israel. And if we're not going to exceptionalize Israel, that means that we don't exceptionalize opposition to its colonialism either. That, you know, I don't think Israel is a worse human rights violator than the United States. I don't think it's a worse human rights violator than Syria. I don't think it's a worse violator than China. And I also don't think it matters. You know, I don't support the Palestinians because they're the most oppressed people in the world. I support them because they are an oppressed people and they are in a struggle and they've asked for my solidarity and they deserve it. My first political work, Ronnie, was actually around South Africa and South African apartheid, because I went to a Black school. It was 1976, the Soweto uprising, and these were high school students, and we were high school students in a mostly Black school. And so we identified with them and their struggle. And that was really how I came into it. And I remained involved. My time in college was sort of one of the first waves of college divestment campaigns around South African apartheid. During the time that I was involved in that, no one ever asked me, are you South African? Have you ever been there? You know, I didn't need to have that identity in order to have legitimacy. And I feel like we need to be working towards that in terms of Jewish identity and Zionism, and opposing Zionist colonialism as part of opposing all colonialism. That, you know, my Jewish identity remains very strong. I mean, I keep kosher to this day on some level. I have my whole life, and people ask me why, because I'm not really very religious. And my answer is because I can't not do it. I mean, it's part of who I am. It's part of how I grew up. It's honoring my long dead father and his family and the struggles that they went through. And it's important to me to maintain that connection. And even, you know, it's more cultural, I would say, for me at this point than it is religious. But does it even matter to make those distinctions? I don't think that it does. But it's not what gives me the right to be anti-colonialist in the context of Palestine. Everybody has that right. And just increasingly, you know, I told some friends the other day that I was doing this panel, and, you know, I said, it's about who owns Jewishness. And one of them said, well, why would anyone want to own that? And I mean, she's a non-Jew from Vermont and older than me. And like, I don't think she thought at all about the connotations of what she was saying. But she said, well, I was just thinking about how much would it cost to buy it? And leaving aside the, you know, feelings that I had about a non-Jew, sort of immediately hearing the word Jewish and going to a question about money, you know, I took that seriously, and I asked myself, what is the cost of Jewishness to us? And, you know, what is the cost that the Zionists try to impose on us for rejecting Zionism? And, you know, that's the thing that, like, I feel it's my duty to resist, is this idea that somehow in rejecting Zionism, I'm losing a connection with people. You know, I've been treated worse in my life by Jews than any other group of people. I mean, starting in middle school and Hebrew school, but that being aside, you know, I never have been spit on by anyone except Jews. I never have been called cunt and dyke for participating at a demonstration except by Jews. And, you know, I look at these people, and many of them, like, they look like my cousins. And I know that if I met them at a bar mitzvah or something, they would be perfectly nice. And I think, how can this be? Like, we're the same people, and how can you hate me this much? And it's that cost that they're trying to impose on me, to say, if you don't support this obviously blatantly racist and oppressive regime, then you can't have your identity. And I just reject that in every possible way. So that's pretty much all I need to say right now.
Thank you, Kate. I was actually thinking about what you're saying for a couple of things. One is that now I'm thinking, my God, I have to explain why the title I chose, because somebody in the Anti-Defamation League or American Jewish Committee or Canary Mission or AMCHA or one of these ilk are going to come and say, look, Rabab Abdel Hadi is so anti-Semitic, she even used owns. And this goes in kind of like, I actually didn't think about it. The reason I actually started using this began in 2001 when I was at NYU at the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. And I was working with the director of the CSGS, Professor Carolyn Dimshaw, and she did an event called Who Owns Gender, in which I was invited to speak. I was maybe one of the junior people. And then we also did another one called Who Owns Race? And so we were actually trying to challenge the question of ownership, that there is, in multiple ways, ownership in private property, ownership in kind of like who's allowed to speak and who's not allowed to speak. When you started saying this, I'm kind of like, oh my God, what am I going? But it also allowed me to kind of speak about that. But I'm also wondering if it's like for me and for all of us in the Palestine movement who are not Jewish, the whole question of definitely being very clearly anti-Zionist and speaking that we are anti-Zionist, that we are fighting against anti-Semitism and refusing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and so on. I think it's a very important political project that even if we want to say, okay, forget it, and then just go back, which I love, maybe people disagree with me. I love Marx's essay on the Jewish question. And I love the ways in which, and I love the Bund, and I love Emma Goldman, and kind of like the people who struggle against, who never ever saw Zionism as a way to actually, to prevent anti-Semitism and attacks against Jews and another Holocaust and so on. I think that we have to keep doing it. I don't know what maybe people disagree, but from where I'm standing, I think that we really need to kind of like doing it again and again and again. And I think it's also a very important project for Arab, Palestinian, Muslim communities, for us to continue saying it and raising the voices and uplifting the voices of Jews who are against the Israeli Zionist project, against Israel violence against the Palestinians and so on, because this is kind of like, this is our comrades. When people say this is part of the project of Palestine liberation, and I agree with you that Palestine is not exceptional. We're not the first or the last people who've been occupied. We're not special. We are not engaging in oppression Olympics. We don't want to do that. But I think it's really, really important to uplift these voices. Maybe you disagree with me, but I felt like I wanted to just say that before the next, and excuse me. Cindy, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. This is such a rich discussion. And actually, your mentioning of Arendt, Rabab, reminded me of my own entry into really kind of understanding the importance of anti-Zionism and of claiming it. Kate, for reasons that you've kind of mentioned, I often don't foreground being Jewish in terms of my Palestine solidarity work, because I feel like it can just be a way of recentering Jewishness, and to be anti-colonial should not require, being Jewish in the context of Israel. At the same time, I think that the insistence on anti-Zionism and the distinction between Zionism and Judaism is so important. And, I mentioned Arendt. I gave a conference paper looking at Arendt's anti-Zionism and kind of situating the treatment that Arendt received over Eichmann in Jerusalem to kind of contemporary clampdowns on free speech. And a Jewish friend of mine confronted me and told me I wasn't really Jewish and I was a horrible scholar. We had this quite terrible fight that we have not recovered from. And it's been decades now. But I gave, and then I thought, what is this that has tapped a nerve that is, in this strong of a way? I gave another version of that paper at another conference, And I was actually shut down by the chair of the conference. My check to support graduate student funding was refused on the grounds that my behavior had been scandalous and outrageous. And this was such a kind of wake-up call to the power of challenging the conflation of Zionism and Judaism. And so I think, and you just see this over and over and again. This week alone, we're hosting Sumaya Awad in Honolulu, and a Zionist group has tried to shut it down by saying that it is so hurtful to the Jewish community. The title of her talk has, kind of how to stop Israel from its project of ethnic cleansing. Now, it's ironic because half of the main organizing body for this is Jewish. And so she has a church talk, and we were, the bishop was just like, well, there is a charge. This is really hurting the Jewish community. And we're just like, well, we're Jewish. So which Jewish community are we talking about here? And so I think that that kind of insistence on anti-Zionism as a form of opposition to colonialism, as an opposition to apartheid, as an opposition to ethnic cleansing it remains important for me, even though I really respect what you're saying, Kate, about insisting that that Zionism is a form of colonialism. It's a racist ideology in the ways that Sarah has been talking about. So I think that, I very much agree with all of those things. I also just want to say that in addition to all the other problems with Zionism, I do feel like Israel's actions make Jews less safe everywhere. And I'm going to include in that people who are inside of 48, who, get these kind of messages on their phone every time the Iron Dome detects activity, even if it's some, sending, panic. Here, I think of my own visit to Hebron in 2013, which was something that I feel like, having gone through the old city of Hebron and seeing what was going on there, how could you not stop everything and just start fighting for Palestine liberation after seeing, settlers raining acid and shit down on people in the streets? But, in terms of security, those settlers, what a life that is for them, to be living, surrounded by people, kind of the military with, in these kind of watchtowers with guns pointed down to protect them. What kind of security is that? What kind of security is that? It's militarization. These are kind of obvious points to everyone here, but I think that to truly have security for Jewish people, you have to stop being violent to a whole other group of people. You have to live in peace with communities of care instead of saying this is ours and equating being anti-Zionist with being anti-Semitic, and also with equating being in support of Palestinians as somehow not being Jewish or being anti-Semitic, because I think it goes that far as well. I'll just add one small story here, which is there was a fake press release that was issued some years ago saying that I had called for a Palestinian rally in Ala Moana Center, Conference Center, and that hundreds had come, which I just thought, if only. But it said that I was calling for the lack of aid to Jewish people in hospitals, and to me this was beyond absurd. And I thought it was ridiculous, but I actually got a call from a relative asking if it was true. And I still get upset thinking about the fact that someone who knew me could think that support for Palestine would translate to wishing upon people a lack of medical care. And then it went from being absurd to just the kind of power of this ideology that conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, support for Palestine as if it's a zero-sum game with hatred of Jews, and wishing their/our death. So I will stop there and pass it along to whoever wants to go next on this.
Well, next is going to be Yoav, who actually will pick up. But I wanted to say I was supposed to give a lecture yesterday at the Cardozo School of Law. I was invited by two young, amazing Jewish law students. And we've been talking about it since October. And they asked me to speak about something called forms of Palestinian activism. So I was racking my brains to figure out what to talk about, how to say it. And they said there is the majority of the people in the club want to understand. It's called something about Israeli-Palestinian conflict or something. And I'm trying to figure out how to do it. I was going to do it online. And then they said that we're going to have a classroom and Zoom you. And I said, no, I'll come. I would like to come in person because I want to be able to have this touch with you, talk with you all, and maybe we can go have dinner afterwards in Washington Heights. And then at the last minute, their dean called them in last Friday and said that the president of Yeshiva University demanded that the event be canceled. And this is the first time that the university cancels the event, tries to cancel the event has been postponed now, and that the dean, the university has hosted a white supremacist. And the dean introduced the white supremacists, but this was impossible for a Palestinian to go to speak. So it's kind of like, and then it was, they said I'm anti-Semitic, I'm, Jew hater, I'm involved in terrorism, and so on and so forth. So I'm just even trying to figure out, wrap my brains about all the costs that all of us have to do. You talk about Cindy, everybody has been faced with death threats, life, the phone calls and so on. And I think this is really appropriate maybe to go to Yoav now, because Yoav, you have been, and please speak about this. Don't just talk about your own experiences. What happened to you? How you've been arrested, how you've been attacked and so on. And I'm not saying that you need to deflect from the Palestinian struggle in which you are involved and struggling and so on, but also there are specific costs to who you are and what you are doing. So if you can actually speak about that in addition to what else you wanted to speak about, would be really great. Thank you. Go ahead.
I can be proud to say that I was arrested in Israel as Palestinian and not as a Jew. The last time that I was arrested from my house is just last April. Before there was nothing happening in the city at the time, no struggle, nothing. But a big force of police and security services broke the main gate and entered my house, my quiet house in Haifa, and take me for interrogation in Shabak offices, security services offices. And these are the section of the security services that is working against Palestinian activity. So if you are, never mind what are your origins, if you are part of the Palestinian movement, then they treat you as Palestinian. This is just one example. I was arrested in different ways more than 60 times. So it's part of life when you are in the struggle that whatever you do, they might try to oppress you. I want to say something about, to go back to the subject of Jewishness. I don't think there is one Jewishness. I think that there were different Jewish communities with different religions or versions of the religion and different cultures and different political experiences. I don't think that there is one Jewish experience everywhere. And I think that Israel has nothing to do with Judaism. I think that the Zionists use religion in order to cement their colonial experience. but there are many ways to see that there is nothing really, no real connection between Judaism and Zionism. And if you take in the history of Israel, the most Israeli, okay, is Rafael, which was the head of the Israeli army, and he was a big war criminal. But he is Ukrainian. He is a Christian Ukrainian. But this doesn't prevent him to be the most Israeli in even in the perception of the Jewish people in Israel. So because he represents the real face of colonialism and settler colonialism, and I think that inside Israel there are also many different communities with different experiences. I think that educated petty bourgeois Israelis and educated petty bourgeois Palestinians are very much the same in their general culture. The only difference between them is political positions, or there are also differences according to tradition or some customs that are different from place to place, but they have much more in common than like Orthodox religious Jews and secular Jewish Israelis. So which culturally have almost nothing to speak between them. And I think what Israel is trying to do, they are only cynically using the Jewish religion in order to force themselves to get support. But actually, you can see the contradictions on every turn and every corner. For example, according to the Jewish establishment of the State of Israel, that is officially supported by the State of Israel, then many American Jews are not regarded to be Jews at all, because they don't recognize reformist Jews or conservative Jews as part of the Jewish establishment, but they recognize Jewishness by heritage. So you can be 100% Christian, but if your mother was or atheist, but if your mother was a Jew, then then you are regarded completely Jew by Israel. But if you are 100% Jewish religious, converted by a reformist rabbi, then you are not regarded to be a Jew at all. So it has nothing to do with Judaism. I don't want to go through all the contradictions, but it is clear that for Israel the main thing it is the settler colonialist project, and not the Jewish religion, not any kind of Jewish culture or heritage. I think I want but to say that when I introduce myself, first of all I say that I'm anti-Zionist, and I think that Israel is not just another imperialist power, because Israel, it's not like, let's say, France has a French territory and it was settler colonialism in Algeria, in Algeria. Well, but Israel is a settler colonialist project from the beginning, and it is the only identity of Israel is a colonialist identity. So it is not a natural state that also have some occupation here or war there or problems with racism, but it is an entity that is defined by this kind of project, and you can see that it is becoming ever clearer that in Israel today, even nobody speak of a political solution. Nobody speak of peace anymore. Like they get all this camouflage, they get rid of it. And Israel, unlike South Africa, I don't want to go to competition of oppression. So maybe some people can be poorer and in very harsh conditions. But unlike South Africa, when the goal of apartheid was to exploit the black population, the ultimate goal of Zionism is to expel or eliminate the Palestinian population. So if they let them work temporarily here or temporarily there, for them it is a concession until the conditions will be better for completing the project of ethnic cleansing. And I think that because of this, we have some chance that when international law will become stronger and people around the world will see that ethnic cleansing is a crime. And I think that it is inevitable that the world will wake up to this reality. Then we have a chance to get rid of Zionism and to force Israel to make major concessions like the white in South Africa made major concessions to get to give up the colonialist project.
Thank you so much, Yoav. I'm going to actually turn it over to Alexi, and then Rani, and then we will move into the last round, and the big question: what is to be done? So, Alexi, please go ahead.
Yeah. So it's interesting, you hear that the ability to maintain contradictions in your own head is a sign of intelligence or whatever. But I really do think it's important. I think this conversation has been interesting in that way. Because I started thinking about who owns Jewishness? And then I'm like, well, maybe the question is like, do I want to? Like who wants to own it? And that one of my main desires for wanting to own my Jewishness is because other Jews are trying to take it away from me. And then therefore that makes me want to keep it. But there's so many dualities to wrestle with, both like writ small and writ large. Like my own family, my grandfather's Ashkenazic, my grandmother was Sephardic, but always identified as Greek, even though they were originally kind of from Turkey. So I think she wanted to think of herself as European. But interestingly, the Sephardic side of my family is way more educated and more sophisticated than the Ashkenazi side. So it's kind of all upside down and backwards. And on the one hand, like I was well into adulthood before I ever even grokked the concept of Jews of color. And yet we were never quite white either. Right. And like, the whole, like, when did Jews become white? And now kind of with the rise of white nationalism, there's definitely ways in which we're not white. Like if you, talk to the tiki torching carrying crowd. And like in my own family, my grandfather's name was Sam, but in his work as an insurance salesman, he went by Steve because somehow that was less Jewish. Bizarre. And by the way, gefilte fish is only good for target practice. That's it. That's what we used it for as kids. We threw it at things. So I'm right there on that front. But one of the things that I think is kind of and also, by the way, Kate, I'm right there with you. I was pepper sprayed once by a fellow Jew who she was literally wrapped in an Israeli flag when she pepper sprayed me in the middle of a JVP event. And like that's as close to, like, I've been involved in politics my whole life, including very physical encounters at women's health clinics and so forth, but never had that level of violence until it was a fellow Jew. So, but, you know, so part of why, one of the things I wrestle with a lot in JVP, sometimes I'm just like, you know what, to hell with the Jews. Like, let's get justice for Palestinians, and it's not going to be because we've changed a lot of minds in the Jewish community. It's going to be because we mobilize the rest of the world. And, you know, so that's one thing I wrestle with. But part of what I like, why I've stuck with JVP all of these years and with enthusiasm is I do think that there's a role for, you know, using my Jewish privilege, if I can put that in quotes, to organize outside of the Jewish community as well, because the narrative is like so thick and so distorted that a lot of, you know, well-meaning non-Jews need to hear from Jews about the fact that Jewishness and Zionism are not the same thing. And you know, the full extent of that, because it's almost like, you know, non-Jewish activists, or at least a wide swath of them, I kind of feel like they've been, you know, bullied and beat down to like, oh, well, there was the Holocaust and we can't say anything bad, you know, we can't go there, you know, in terms of criticism of Israel. And so that it's genuinely, you know, there is a contribution to be made to the movement, the wider movement. And, you know, things like, as a high-tech worker, I'm really interested in this no tech for apartheid. First of all, like, they adopted the apartheid thing like way sooner, like now, like that it's evidence that like that is becoming a mainstream idea, which I think is a huge positive, you know, because, you know, the whole question of like, do I describe myself as an anti-Zionist? And I do. And I appreciate, Kate, where you're coming from on that, and like the de-exceptionalizing of Israel. But I also, one of the contradictions that I think we need to wrestle with is we need to start where people are, right? I mean, like, that's the key to all political organizing. And so many people, even people who think they understand colonialism and may even sort of are beginning to understand the fundamental colonialist underpinnings of the United States, don't get it when it comes to Israel. And so I think we need to help do that. And like this no tech for apartheid, as a longtime tech worker, I've always just, I describe it as my day job, and sure, I'm a geek and I love data, and that's fine, right? But I've actually always thought that the level of social consciousness in the tech community was lower than average. And a lot of people, oh, we'll just build a tool and that'll fix it. It's like, that, you know, that when you need to hammer something, okay, fine, you know, having the right tool is great, but that's not how this works. And so to see tech workers, you know, and they're beginning to see their role as workers, which I think is part of it. So, you know, I think it's part of a larger movement in tech. You're starting to see labor organizing and other things. People realizing that the so-called gig economy is not what it's cracked up to be. But even like the people at Google who have good jobs, you know, and are coming out and taking a stand, saying they don't want the companies they work for to be complicit in this stuff. And so to me, that is it's a very exciting development. It's also local. I mean, you know, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've worked in Silicon Valley for decades. And so, you know, me as a Jewish organizer, I think I can, and a high tech worker, you know, it's like it positions me well to kind of work in that space and help them get a clear political analysis and project a powerful anti-Zionist message. So
thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, I thought you did. You raised so many things, but I will wait until for the last round. Rani is speaking now, and when we come to the last round, I have a few questions to raise about what's going on. Maybe give some announcements and then raise, including not only what's to be done and what are some of the issues. So I'm going to just turn it over to Rani and not comment on any of the stuff that's
Thanks,
Rafael.
Thanks, Rafael. I think the advantage of coming at the end is listening to everybody and being able to make a point, especially to the students, that we're not all the same. We're Jewish or come from a Jewish background, and we have different views and ideas of our identity. I, for instance, don't belong to South African Jews for Justice because I don't associate myself as being a Jew anymore, although I have a Jewish heritage and I owe a great deal to it. But I support them to the hilt. They are very important, and those Jews for justice for Palestine all over the world are my sisters and my brothers, and I support them unreservedly. But I belong outside of South African Jews for Justice to Palestine Solidarity Committee, and I meet with the South African Jews for Justice in the broad umbrella of BDS. So people should understand that even with those like us, who to a large degree, except perhaps for Yoav, who's an Israeli, the rest of us, Sarah, I'm not sure where she lives. Okay. Can you remind me, Sarah?
I live in Hawaii.
Oh my goodness, that's really far. Okay, so there's very great distinction, let's face it, between whether you're British or French Jews or the American or Argentinian or the South African. I think the South African Jews, and we're leaving aside the unconventional, the anti-Zionist types, I found are very similar to Jews of Canada or the United States who are so profoundly Zionist. And let me now come to an interesting point, an anecdote that Dr. Rabab Abdul Hadi, and I'm giving her professorial name because we're speaking to the students, Rabab, but you'll all bear in mind how Rabab talked about me having been part of that particular teaching where we had our great heroic Leila Khaled present and how it was banned. In the lead up to that event and all the promotion and advertising that Rabab had been responsible for, suddenly, like 1 month beforehand, sitting here in South Africa, I suddenly was assailed by emails from former schoolmates going back 60 years, guys in their 80s like me, who'd last seen me that many years ago, and who were emigres from South Africa, not because of the politics, not because they didn't like apartheid, not because, like me, they were exiles having fought the good fight against apartheid, but because, like a lot of those, whether they were Jews or other whites, were clearing out of South Africa at certain times because it was an uncomfortable place and a dangerous place to be. They suddenly started attacking me as the old school chum who had become traitor, a self-hating Jew, and they really attempted to intimidate me against becoming involved with Rabab's teaching. And that's what she was referring to in letters I wrote back to them. Because it was a question of who actually owns the Judaic morality, the best thing in terms of our heritage. And for me, what I still find so seminal in what makes me is during the Second World War and just after, and a young Jewish boy living in this absolutely enclosed Jewish community, very small community, 100,000 out of 5 million whites or so, and, millions more blacks. I was revolted by the beatings I saw white thugs dishing out to a black man who might not have got off the pavement in time. And I'd seen these pictures of the concentration camps in the cinemas and on newsreels, crying my eyes out. And I said to my mother, whose hand I was holding when we saw one of these beatings in the middle of Johannesburg outside a cinema, and we went home, I was crying, I couldn't sleep, and I said, the way black people are being treated in South Africa is that the way Jews were treated in Germany. And this woman who, to make money, reinforce what was coming into the home. My father was a factory worker, used to take part-time jobs. She went to school to the age of 16. She wasn't political, but she was really a decent, warm-hearted person. And she said to me, it's not quite like that because, as you know, people have been butchered in those camps. But it starts this way. It starts this way as we see it in South Africa. Ronald, you must have respect for people. Don't use the language the neighbors use about black people. Never behave in this way. Respect people. And I came to understand, by the time I was 13 or so and reading quite a bit, that the main tenet of the morality of Judaism was that which was stated by the sage Hillel, more or less around the time of Jesus. And that was, in the Christian terms, be unto others, treat others as you would wish them to treat you. And it really sat within me. I owe my mother so much for that. And as I developed through high school, I've mentioned in the introductory part how I came to associate, as Yoav, as Kate and others have, with black society, with those who were under the kosh, under the jackboot. And that's what changed my life. So when I compared myself to these schoolboys, my peers, and where they stood, I could see, and I still do today, as a lapsed Jew, that in fact I carry with me something that was invaluable. But you know something, another anecdote, I get involved in the struggle, and we were compartmentalized for geographic reasons, and I found myself in an underground unit of a dozen white people. I was like 20. And at that stage, I was used to seeing, albeit the behavior of my schoolboy chums living in San Francisco, LA years later, we had seen that Jewish people in that period, certainly not now in South Africa, in that period, that they behaved somewhat better than the English and the Dutch descendants to black people. So I'd seen a little bit relative of the softness that I think we all know you can get out of a good Jewish home to other people at charity, etc. I sat in this meeting, looked around at fellow subversives, and at that stage my mind was still in the ghetto, the cocoon, and I looked at the other 11 and I thought, they all look Jewish to me. And when we got on more familiar terms sometime later, and we were chatting again over coffee or so, I discovered I was the only one of the 12 who was actually Jewish. So this whole question of what is Jewishness, who is Jewish, I would really like to refer the students, Rabbi, I'm sure we all know of Isaac Deutscher and his famous essay, The Non-Jewish Jew. Because he was lapsed, it was really written for secular leftist Jews, many of whom take that as their badge of identity. I don't quite fit in there because, as I've said, non-Jewish Jew, I'm just a lapsed Jew that carries that particular heritage, which brings us all together and brings us to a point where, like Yoav, and depending where we come from these different historic backgrounds, even the grouping of you who come from the USA. So I come from the struggle in South Africa, and it's not difficult for us to see, once we get the information and the experience and the struggle against colonialism, to see that exactly what has taken place in Israel, in Palestine, in historic Palestine, is exactly the dispossession of a people, a colonial dispossession, a Zionist, racist colonial project aligned with imperialism for the very reasons that the USA, that Britain, that Churchill, that Balfour, that Herzl before them saw in the idea of a Jewish homeland, in Herzl's terms, a wall against Asian barbarism, which is the role that Israel plays to this day. Just to say this to Kate, and I listened to you with great interest and so on, where we differ is, together with other freedom fighters, if I use that term, who have visited the Palestinian occupied territories. From the time of Tutu, 1989, the Archbishop, to many other ANC, Communist Party, liberation people like myself, many others, certainly in relation to Gaza and the West Bank, we see this as even worse than the suffering under apartheid. And so many people going there of my ilk come away shaking their heads and saying, my goodness, and these are Black people saying this is far worse than what we suffered under during the apartheid days. The question of the Jews, sorry, not the Jews, the Palestinian people living within Israel itself, yes, that's not quite the suppression, the outright suppression of Black people in South Africa, but certainly it qualifies as apartheid, B'Tselem, the latest amnesty report, never mind what South Africans have seen. Once we had visited, I never visited, and I decided never to set foot in Israel itself. I only go into Gaza or the West Bank until I was basically banned. And just out of principle, I decided I would not visit Israel itself. I've got relatives from South Africa living there, some of whom I really like, others who despise me and I was excommunicated, etc. But it took some time and interaction with Palestinians, the narrative, the experiences, Rabbi, what you teach, what so many others do, both Jews like Ilan Pape or Yuri Davis, but Palestinians who live in Israel. We have found it's so akin, the relationship between a Jew and a Palestinian within Israel, as comparable to the South African situation in terms of that discrimination, and people, and especially the Jews, who never go near a Palestinian community within Israel itself, never mind in the OPTs. So that's it. We do know, just the final point here, that when it comes to devout people, look at the differences between Jews and their view of Israel, where you've got Hasidic Jews who just won't recognize Israel as a state and join us in terms of BDC and protests against Israel, and they go back to the Bible in relation to exactly why they cannot accept this state. They go back to the Torah and the law, etc. And that's the religious Jews themselves. This huge difference. Those Jews like us who are a minority in Israel, like Yoav, Ilan Pape and the like, or internationally, we see that we have a very important role to play. And it's been said here, sorry, I can't remember who, that's the last point I want to make. I think it might have been you, Alexei, but whoever, who said that it's so important that we can bear testimony, but in action as well as words, to say we are anti-Zionist, we are anti-colonial settler Israel. We don't equate being anti-Israel or anti-Zionism with being anti-Semitic. Yeah, absolutely not. We'll fight that as strongly as we can, as strongly as we need to show our solidarity, as Yoav does, with the Palestinian people, because it's their birthright, and it's only when I believe there's a unitary state, such as we fought for in South Africa, that you could really have the full equality and move towards a democracy that's taking place in South Africa, as difficult as that stage becomes.
Thank you so much, Rani. And okay, first of all, I want to say to the audience and the students that we're sorry, we have a lot of things to say, as you can understand, and the debate and the discussion is very lively. And I personally really don't want this class to end. I mean, this is okay. First thing. Secondly, I want to raise a few questions, and basically there are 3 people who have to leave exactly in a few minutes. We only have 3 minutes for that, but some folks have agreed to stay a little bit longer. So one question is, we didn't call it Jews Speak Out. We said who owns Jewishness, but obviously all the presenters here come from Jewish background. So that's one of the questions. Is this something we do? How do we do it? And so on. Secondly, I just wanted to say, what do you think about, maybe we didn't talk about it, but maybe mention it or talk about it in the future, that, okay, Alexei, is that what everybody thinks? Okay. So the second question is the whole question of, and I think a few of you referred to it, the whole question of white supremacy, the rise of white supremacy, and the question in which we face quote unquote replacement theory, but we also see Zimmer in France, who is also of Jewish origins, actually raising all sorts of xenophobic and anti-immigrant and things and so on. How do we think about that? The third question is that, okay, there is a question about how the Holocaust is being utilized by Zionists in order to suppress others. But there is also Jewish groups who have actually protested at the Homeland Security and ICE and said never again for anyone, never again for anyone, not just never again for Jews. There is the whole question of surveillance and how do we think about it, and from NSO to what's happening on the bridge to the tech and so on and so forth. Then there is the question of kind of like maybe including people like Naturi Karta and other folks in the future. So I would like to ask people people who really need to leave ASAP, Alexei, Sarah, and Kate, if you want to kind of like 1 minute, and then we can go to Rani, Yoav, and Cindy and do final statements. Just anything you want to say. It's a complete continuing conversation. So I will call Alexei first. Go.
So yes, I'm sorry. I do have to go. One thing I would comment on, because we just haven't really brought it up, is liberal Zionism. I mean, we've kind of touched on things that touch on it, but I think part of why I do feel it's important to identify as a Jewish anti-Zionist is to expose just how flawed, just at at the most fundamental level that liberal Zionism is. You know, a lot of people think, oh, it's the reasonable solution and it's a two-state solution, and like it doesn't address anything from a social justice perspective. It just fails at the most fundamental level, and that is also part of why I try to be very clear as being an anti-Zionist Jew. And I literally now have to go. So thank you so much. And it was great to talk with and meet the fellow panelists. And I hope to do it again.
Thank you so much, Alexi. Thank you. And Kate, I think, left. Sarah, but Kate already said that she needed to leave at exactly at this. Sarah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really am so grateful to have been a part of this wonderful dialogue and conversation. And, you know, just want to reiterate that Judaism is a religion. Being Jewish is not necessarily. It is a part of a community that we are a part of. And as a community, it's important that we are grounded in anti-white supremacist, anti-imperialist values. Today I'm wearing my Leila Khaled shirt that says, freedom is not terrorism. And I wore this shirt in front of my Zionist grandmother who was born and raised in the Bronx, and she had nothing to say to it. And that's okay, because what is important is that we continue. What is important is that we continue to resist. And resistance cannot happen unless we're being active. And so it's important for us as people that have somehow ended up here to be active in our resistance to Zionism and active in our support of Palestinians and Palestine. So thank you so much for letting me be here today.
So nice to meet you. And we will be in touch. We'll see each other probably next month in Hawaii. Next, bye, Tara. Next, we want to hear from Yoav. Also very brief concluding remarks, and then Ronnie, and then. Unmute yourself, please.
I think for me, we should what we should take the narrative into our own hands. And I think that for me, the basic point is a humanistic point and the justice point, and not a religious or specific community, but general human values. And I think that from this point of view, for me, it is important to say that there is only one Palestine from the river to the sea. And the division is artificial division that is made by Zionism in order to separate the Palestinian people, the different parts of the Palestinian people. But for the Zionists, all of Palestine is one land that they occupy and settle in. And the division is only used, you know, in order to confuse the question, in order to weaken the Palestinian resistance. Also, I think that we should be clear about our goals. And I think that when we say that our goal is one man, one vote, like one democratic state with same rights for all the people, then we put Israel on a clear offside in the international game, yani. And I think it is important for us, and I think that what Israel is trying to establish is the right for ethnic cleansing, because if you think that 48 is proper Israel, like this is a legitimate Israeli territory, it is more Israeli than the West Bank only because the ethnic cleansing in 48 was more complete than the ethnic cleansing in 67. So if we get the legitimacy of Israeli occupation in the 48 territories, then it shows the way that if they continue the ethnic cleansing also in the West Bank, it will also become a legitimate Israeli territory. So I think we should refuse it and that if we stand by human principles, our goal is clear, and only we have to make it clear for everybody.
Thank you, Yoav. Ronnie?
Sorry, did you recognize me?
I recognize you for 1 minute concluding remarks.
Okay, I want to quickly say two things. One is anti-Semitism. So what Zionists said to the Jewish people, I'm talking about from Herzl's time, is that we have to be together and we have to find our own homeland because the rest of humanity are intrinsically anti-Semitic. And we'll always face that. That will be our fate. So as Jews, we must come together. We must stick together. We must have our own homeland. The opposite to that was the socialist answer. And they argued the Zionists were not the majority for many years, even in South Africa. And that was the way to provide security for Jewish people wherever they lived is to fight for a democratic society, democratic rights, full equality where they live. Coming to the Palestinian issue, I go totally along with Yoav about a single state. So I don't want to waste time now, but just to say that the way we can help the Palestinian people is through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Isolate Zionist Israel the way apartheid South Africa was isolated, and this weakened their position. It made a lot of the whites in South Africa begin to think differently. The same thing will happen within Israel. And for particularly USA Jews, the question of taking to task the American government and its total support for Israel year after year, the billions that providing impunity for Israel. This is a major issue that we must take up all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, Rani. Thank you, Yoav. Thank you, Cindy, Sarah, Kate, Alexi. Getting really sick. Everybody who has participated, Cindy, everybody who participated today, it has been really amazing, very informational for me. Even I've been learning about this stuff all my life, and still there is more things to learn. This has been very lively, very organic, very dynamic discussion. We will be having more of it. To the students, please watch, critique, ask questions. And we will be seeing you in the next part of the series, as well as other Ahmed open classrooms as we come along. Thank you again, and good night, good afternoon.
Good night. Thanks for having us.
Goodbye. You were amazing, all of you. Thank you.